Hello, this is going to be my brief review for this MP5 game player, known as an MP5, whatever that is. And it's basically shaped like the PSP. And as you can see, it's actually labeled PSP, but it's clearly not. That's the other side of it. This thing has a protective skin over it. It has a 0.3 megapixel camera built into it, which is very crappy. Some shoddy speakers on the bottom. It has a port here for the AC input to charge it, and here is the slot for the micro SD card. I'm not sure what the maximum you can input into this thing for an SD card. On the top here we have a mini USB port to sync it up to your computer, or you can use this as a flash drive if you wanted to. And it's got a port here, a 3.5 millimeter for the headphones out, and for a video audio out to hook up to your television with the red, white, and yellow cables. And of course the hard power switch, which I never use. On top here it's got two shoulder buttons that are cheaply implemented into it. It's got a D-pad. It's got a little miniature rocker that this one seems to be defective because it acts like it wants to push right inside of the unit, so I usually don't try to use that. You know, it's got the basic PSP/Sony button setup here with a select and start here. Now all those little specks you see on the screen here is actually dust that has collected inside of it underneath this protective plastic coating. This does not have a touch screen on it like some of the devices do nowadays. So let's boot this thing up and see what actually it can do. And you get that when you first turn it on. And it comes up to a rather simple user interface here, similar to an MP3 player. You have your photo function, you view photos, ebook reader, which is pretty basic. You got a sound recorder. This thing does have a built-in mic here somewhere on it, I'm not sure. Maybe on the top here, that little hole. It's got the MP3 player function, of course. It's got the camera, which is only a 0.3 megapixel, although on the little circle here, you can't see it because of the focus, but it actually does say 10.0 megapixel, and that's a blatant lie. It's got the video player, and this thing does sort of well playing videos. You don't have to convert a lot. It plays flash videos, AVIs, MP4s, 3GPs, and a couple RMVBs, a couple other types. You know, it's got a basic calendar. You can't put any events in there, like appointments or anything. It just displays the calendar. It's got the game function, which emulates Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, regular Nintendo, Super Nintendo, and the Sega Genesis. It has a FM radio built into it, but it only works if you use a set of headphones, which acts as the antenna. Otherwise it won't pick anything up. It's got an alarm on it, the settings, which I found the settings menu to be sort of similar to a iPod, you know, a rip-off of that. And of course it's got the resource manager, which acts like your file manager on it, pretty much. So the main function of this device really is the game emulation that this thing has on it. Now, this thing, like I said, can emulate Game Boy games, Game Boy Advance, NES, Sega, and SNES. Game Boy emulation and the Game Boy Color is pretty decent. It does stretch the image to fit the screen so that, you know, stretches the image a little bit. Alright, we'll just go through these one by one here, and I'll show you a brief demonstration of something. Let's see. I'll go to Dragon Warrior 1 and 2. That was always a good game. And this particular model has 4 gigabytes internal memory. I don't have a flash card or a micro SD card in it at this time, but you could always input one if you wanted to. Of course. It does fairly well for Game Boy Color games. Let's hit continue. Go to Hush. And it does stretch the image, so you do see more pixelation, but it isn't bad. It runs pretty smoothly. Yep. As you can see, it runs pretty fluently on this. Exit out of there. And we'll move on to the Game Boy Advance emulator, which is hit or miss with different ROMs. Some ROMs it performs pretty well, other ones it lags horribly. Let's see. Take for instance Final Fight. You know, that's a 16-bit port pretty much, and it actually lags pretty bad on that title, which doesn't make sense. But a title like Iridian 3D, it plays extremely well, which puzzles me. With the exception of this beginning little animation here of the menu. But once you get past that blip, this thing functions very well, this particular ROM. Entered. As you can see, it's moving fluently and emulating near, I don't want to say near perfectly, but pretty well. There's no real skips in the animation, the audio is fluent, and overall I'm impressed with emulation. Like I said, it's pretty much hit or miss with the Game Boy Advance ROMs. If you want to try to play something like Doom or Wolf 3D or anything like that on the Game Boy Advance, you might as well hang it up. And there's other ones that don't fare as well, but a majority do alright. Now for the real crown jewel of this emulator is the NES function, which plays NES ROMs pretty accurately. Any one that you choose, it'll do pretty well. Let's go to this one. I always use Mario 1 as a benchmark test in a way for emulators. And as you can see, get this thing positioned. It does pretty well. If I can't even hit the block, then something's wrong. Finally. That, in my opinion, makes it worth the 40 bucks that I paid for it almost 2 years ago. The ability to play Super Mario with dedicated hardware buttons in pretty good accuracy. Now, down to the Sega Genesis emulator. This one doesn't fare too well. There is some slight lag in the animation department, and the audio seems to suffer. Now, of course, that is all very much ROM dependent also. We'll play, actually, use Sonic the Hedgehog, which I always use as a benchmark test for the Genesis emulators. Now, as you can see, the audio has slowed down a bit on this ROM. As has the animation. I'm sad to say my old Wonder Media 8650 Android 2.2 tablet that supposedly had an 800 megahertz processor emulated the Sega Genesis better than this does. So, as far as the Sega goes, I'm not too impressed. Now, unfortunately, the worst emulation is of the Super Nintendo, which really does suck, but that's what you get for a $40 device that, take for instance, well, use Super Mario World. Now you're going to see exactly what I mean here, if I can get the camera straight. Alright now. And you can see, I don't know if that's because of the ROM itself or the emulation trying to interpret the ROM, the sea has turned to green and black. This must be the Nuclear Waste Zone Mario Edition. But as you can see, this thing is very choppy. Still very playable, but if you're used to the actual nice running version, this is very much an irritation. As you can see, it's very choppy, and that stinks. Tetris Attack, another very good title for the SNES, is slaughtered by the emulator on this device. The audio suffers in this, and the animation suffers horribly. Definitely noticeable lag, to the point where it makes the title pretty much not enjoyable to even try to attempt to play. Oh well, what do you expect for a $40 device? This thing also does the movie function fairly well. As long as you keep the resolution of the files to 320 by 240, you should be alright. And there's a little bit of blips in the running of the video, but you get what you pay for, pretty much. If I could go back in time and not purchase this device, I would have not purchased it and waited for something of a lot better quality. But I was kind of trying to jump on the bandwagon with these because I was amazed that there was emulators out there with dedicated hardware buttons like you can see here.
Oh yeah, okay, Dad. I act like I'm 6. Any luck finding a
not too bad playing videos. If you were to pay 20 bucks for this device, I would say it's worth it, but anything more than 20 bucks, don't waste your money on it.